are we? Welcome back to Conversations with Rob. Today I have a class interviewee. His name is Paul Meany. Paul Meany is the editor of intellectual history at the Cato Institute, and he's also the producer and presenter of a podcast called Portraits of History, which is run through libertarianism.org.
Two corrections to make, but
two corrections.
Two corrections. They're already off to the. It's Portraits of Liberty, and I am not the producer. I have a wonderful producer named Landry Ayres who does all the technical thing. I am merely the host, the conduit. He does all the actual audio and all that. I could never do that. I'm terrible at technology. But yes, Portraits of Liberty is the podcast.
It is your smooth voice that runs through it. I was listening to a couple of episodes this week, and it's fascinating what you learn from history. Like, you go right back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I try to go as many places as I can.
Yeah, some of that stuff is really fascinating. But let's talk about your journey to libertarianism, because you're an Irish man like myself, and there's not many of us on this sod, is there?
No, not really.
So how did you get roped in?
Yeah, we should never travel on the same plane, or else we'll decimate the libertarian population of Ireland if anything happens. So I wasn't really much of a reader until I was like 17 or so. Yeah, that's when I first started properly reading things. I barely read books before that.
Wow.
I started reading, but I literally decided I was going to be a smarter person one day. Then I went to my school's library and I saw Plato's Republic, and I looked it up. That's what smart people read. So that's what I did. I read it, hated it, didn't understand it, decided I had to read the next thing. So then I read Aristotle, who I preferred, but I still didn't really get it. And I kind of just tried to read philosophy chronologically. Eventually I got much more interested in something like political philosophy, ethics, and all that jazz. And so then I had to decide what my political position was, because the most important part of reading all this is to have a point and to argue with people all the time about everything. I used to be much worse. And so I slowly became a libertarian. I started off as a very economic libertarian because I read Milton Friedman. And I read Milton Friedman at a very, very opportune time. So I read Capitalism and Freedom, really enjoyed it. I was convinced by a lot of the arguments. But then I went to Cuba for a holiday.
Oh, libertarian paradise.
Yeah, of course, Socialist Republic, wonderful. And then I was like, I'll read more into this market you speak of. And so it was the first country I've been to that, like, you know, when you're going on holidays, you go to all these other countries, and they're not that much different. You know, things might be cheaper or something, or like maybe have a little more rundown in this place or that place. This is the first place I went to in the world where I was like, okay, this is noticeably different to Ireland. Like, I would not want to live here.
Yeah.
I'm normally going to go on holidays like, oh my God, I'm in Orlando and Disneyland. I'd love to live here forever. But this is the first time I was like, cool to be here, but I would never want to live here in any sort of capacity whatsoever. No way. I remember when we stayed at this resort, and there was the state-run Coke company, Ciego Montero, and there was like two different beers, something like Caballero and something else. But yeah, it was bizarre. And then I like talking to people. It was really weird as well. Taxi drivers are apparently not wealthiest, but they make a lot of money because they talk to tourists and tourists tip them. And it turns out taxi drivers make more than doctors sometimes. I just thought it was crazy at the time, and I didn't understand how this had happened.
There's two currencies in Cuba, though, right? There's the tourist currency and the
convertible one. Yeah, you have to convert it, and then it's worth way more. So if you give the convertible currency to a regular person, they're like, "Oh my God, thank you!" Because I once gave like one away, and it's worth like 25 at the time. I don't know what it is now. But yeah, I was also there. We were in the same hotel when we were in Havana as there was people from the US coming over to do some sort of negotiation. That I remember saw these guys in suits, and I was like, that's very interesting. Then I realized I was part of this big historical moment just sitting there. So yeah, I started off being like libertarian because, like, in a negative way, because I was like, oh, this is a system I don't like.
Right.
And so then I was mostly economic for a very long time. All my arguments centered around the free market being like this, that, and the other. It just produces the goods, and that's that. You know, capitalism is the best system we have. But then I transitioned the more I read into it, the idea that you should compare ideal to ideal, and compare ideal socialism or an ideal capitalism or ideal conservatism and ideal this, that, the other. And I feel that's a much more level way to discuss. Like, sometimes I have a fear that people say just because you can't achieve it now, we should never bother trying it.
Mm.
And like maybe there are better systems out there, but you have to compare ideal to ideal and what they want to promote. And I realize that libertarianism promotes all the values that I agree with, like plurality, a lot of freedom of choice, constantly stressing the individual's importance in life,
Mm.
not trying to organize every single little aspect. And in a practical and a utopian sense, I think it was the best idea for me. And I never looked back. I never had a phase of anything else. That's my claim to fame, is I never had my romantic left-wing phase. I was an old man from day one.
Well, good for you, because
Mm-hmm.
I did. I came from sort of just kind of general lefty social democratic, we have to have welfare because people fall through the cracks. Yeah, that's where I kind of came from. So you didn't miss much. But we met through SFL. Beatrice
Mm-hmm.
introduced us back in, was it 2017?
Sure.
Maybe
Let's
2017.
say that.
But you dragged your heels getting involved with Students for Liberty
Mm-hmm.
for a
I
while. What
did.
what was going on there, Paul?
Uh, Ever the individualist. I just didn't want to be part of any sort of group. No, I don't know, I was very reluctant to go into anything to do with politics. I thought it was kind of weird, and I just wanted to sit around and read. I didn't really want to have to discuss things. I don't really like arguing that much, which sounds really weird. Most people who like politics enjoy arguing to a very irritating degree. But I just like I just love chatting to people and getting their opinions, and not really like attacking them over, just trying to understand them,
Mm.
which sounds like I'm trying to up myself up, like, oh, I'm so understanding and I'm so nice and everyone else is the worst. But I hated getting angry and shouting at people, so arguing just never suited me particularly. And so I thought that that's what would happen if I joined any sort of group. I would just have to shout at someone eventually. But I dragged my heels for a while, but I eventually decided I have nothing on my CV. I had very little. I had, I'd worked in a supermarket stacking shelves. Wasn't particularly big into extracurricular activities besides reading about history and philosophy, which probably doesn't look too good. So I decided I had to do something. And so I joined Students for Liberty as a local coordinator. And it quickly, yeah, it was brilliant. It went very well, very quick. Went to a lot of great places, met a lot of great people, a lot of great discussions, a lot less shouting than I thought. That was great. So yeah, it was wonderful. And it helped me get where I am today.
Yeah, exactly. Your focus in your degree was history. What was interesting about history? Obviously, reading, like you were reading the philosophers and stuff. What made you choose to get on the history route in Trinity?
Well, my degree wasn't just history. I tell people it's history because it's a mouthful to say. My degree is ancient and medieval history and culture, which
Oh,
the only thing you get asked is, what are you going to do with that? And I always said, become a medieval knight. Still to this day waiting. Um,
it's coming.
but I decided what my job would be when I was 8 years old. And I have the job I want when I was 8 years old. Well, I didn't know I was going to work at a libertarian think tank when I was 8. But I said I'd be a historian because I played the game Rome Total War. It was two games, Rome Total War and Age of Empires, when I was a kid. Got me really,
Amazing.
really into history. So it was like obviously a big grand strategy game where you command armies and conquer the world. But you could read all these descriptions for the buildings you make and the units you build. And I started reading all these, and I was just so engrossed by like military history. And then I started reading about all the battles. But then I started reading a bit more about the actual politics and how it all really worked, not just generals and whatnot. But originally, I started out being just a kid who just really liked cool battles and cool historical films. Like I'm watching Gladiator, like Kingdom of Heaven and stuff when I was young, and I thought it was the bomb.
Mm.
But so I decided I wanted to do history, and I got into Trinity, thank God. Didn't get in the traditional way. I actually got in through an access program where I had to write an essay about the topic of my choice. My topic was the Seven Samurai movie, which is. But I didn't get in on points. I was not good at. I was terrible at school. Actually, I thought I was very, very unintelligent for a very long time. I wasn't particularly good at school. It was a miserable experience. 1 second, my charger went out. But yeah, I did not have a good time, and I thought learning was a very boring process. Boring process that I would never be too into. I didn't even know what I was going to do in college. I when when I got my leaving cert results, you get a little notification saying what courses have been offered to you, and I was offered two things. I was offered hotel management and ancient and medieval history and culture. Nothing against hotel management whatsoever, perfectly fine career. But I was like, I could not do hotel management. So But that was my first choice, ancient and medieval history. I wanted that very badly. And so I got to college and I adored it. I thought it was so great, the freedom you had to just study any topic you wanted. Lectures were always open to you discussing something different. And so for a while, because I was interested in economics at the time, I'm not that it's not interesting, or just not as much anymore. I thought I would do something along the lines of economic history, but slowly but surely, I just kept reading philosophy, and I was like, how do we change our ideas? There were so many terrible ideas in the past. Like
Mm,
there really was some gruelingly terrible ideas in history that are just the worst. I don't know how anyone ever believed them. And so that was my aim. I was going to say, how did people actually believe these terrible ideas to begin with, and how do we get to the good ideas that we have now? And that was what I decided. So I decided I'd study intellectual history more and more. And so everything I did revolved around that. Whenever I had an essay in college, I'd always ask the lecturer if I could do my own twist on it, my own spin. So,
brilliant.
yeah.
What did you focus your thesis on?
My thesis was on what dissertation? It swaps between the two. I don't
Yeah.
dissertation for me, but so if you call it a thesis, it's north or south. I don't know. My dissertation was on the famous Roman philosopher, statesman, orator, and lawyer, quite the CV, Cicero, and his influence in the founding fathers. The reason I did
Wow.
it, I got very into Cicero, and I had a module on Cicero that I just like. It made me fall in love with him further. I read everything he possibly ever wrote. Of all the people in the ancient world, we have the most about Cicero. You've got like all his personal letters, his speech, not all, but like a lot of his personal letters, his speeches, a
Mm,
lot of his philosophical works. And so I just thought he was a perfect person to study. And I was really interested in American history. And I was wondering, it was because I read one quote. It was Thomas Jefferson talking about the Declaration of Independence, where he lists off his influences of the books of public right. And he references Cicero. And I was like, hey,
hmm.
let's see. And I just decided, let's go down the rabbit hole. Turns out this rabbit hole is very profitable, and Cicero was a colossal influence, and it went really well. I really enjoyed it. But just there's people have always written books about how Rome and America are very similar, which
Mm,
is an easy way to describe how obsessed the Americans were with the Romans. The White House today, you can't see it now. It's underwater. It's underground now. But there was a small creek at the White House, and they renamed it Tiber Creek after the Tiber River in Rome. And in Rome, there's also the Capitoline Hill, spelled with an O. You have to wonder the Capitol Hill and the Capitoline Hill.
okay.
Also,
That's
Rome was
interesting.
right next to a place called the Pontine Marshes. DC is a swamp. And so you start to see all these ridiculous parallels. And once you start doing that, you can't stop. You realize how often they read these people as ridiculous, and how much they're constantly quoting them. And so a lot of people, a lot of historians talked about how John Locke, famous philosopher, the second treatise or
Mm,
two treatises on government, was massively influential to Americans. And that's true. But they also had a huge breadth of ancient authors they were constantly referencing as well, and especially Cicero. And when they were schoolboys, they would have been reading Cicero from like the age of 8. They'd have to learn his orations. To get into the college entrance exams, for the few colleges there were at the time, you would have had to translate Cicero from Latin. It was all these different things you would have to do. So he was always in the curriculum. And then even in college, people kept going on about Cicero. And the reason why he was so popular was because he he wasn't, a lot of philosophers, like if you want to talk about Plato's a great guy, great philosopher, smart guy, thumbs up, go ahead. But he was never really a politician, or not that we know of particularly. And like all these different people throughout history, you're like, yeah, you were great at thinking, but you never really walked the walk, did the thing. But Cicero did. Cicero was a very practical man, and the only reason he really wrote a lot of his philosophy was because in the last years of his life he was exiled from the political scene, and he was rabidly depressed and had to do something to keep himself occupied. So he was just viciously writing philosophy. In some of his letters, he talks about how he's just writing this to write this, and if he doesn't like the book, he's going to throw it in the sea and write another one after. He really just wanted to do something.
wow.
And so he wrote these amazing philosophical books. One of the most important is called De Officiis, which means on duties. And it's a weird thing that On Duties possibly was the most, next to the Bible, the most read book up until the 19th century in the world, most cited and read book. If you actually read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, he quotes Cicero constantly, but doesn't reference him because it's so commonplace that people know who Cicero is that you don't even bother
Interesting.
to reference it. It was huge. But so Cicero was a practical man, and the Americans liked that. They liked that he wasn't just a thinker. He was a person who did things and had
Mm,
real experience.
skin in the
That's,
game.
and he was his career. What he liked to think of himself, he was a lawyer, and he had all these amazing speeches. And so he was a rhetorical model. He was like an amazing speechwriter, but he also like used his skills to defend the Roman Republic, especially with this set of speeches called the Philippics, where he's condemning Mark Antony, and that was kind of viewed as this amazing silver-tongued person standing up against an oppressor with the one weapon he has. And people start to realize it's about how you package it, it's how you inspire people. That's why Cicero was deemed amazing. So there were all these oratory books at the time. They always have Cicero, and they're always talking about how you need to learn from him constantly. And people such as Frederick Douglass, the later abolitionist, I don't know, I don't remember the exact name of the book, but he used some of his money to buy a book of speeches, and in it there was a speech by Cicero, of course. And you can see that constantly people are paraphrasing him constantly. So yeah, he's quite the guy. The person he influenced most was John Adams. John Adams was the second president of the United States and a wonderful writer who's woefully underrated these days. But John Adams really had a massive influence on the American Constitution, especially with something called bicameralism. But that's a little too complicated for now, so we're going to put that to bed. But basically, if you look at John Adams' diary that he kept for like 50 years or so, he's always reading Cicero. And he's always being inspired by him to do something. So, for example, there was the Boston Massacre happened. The soldiers shot into a crowd of people. No lawyer in town would even touch them because, like, why would you? If you defended the British soldiers, you're basically out of the revolution. You'll look like a weirdo. You might even be tarred and feathered, like a lot of people were. But John Adams stepped up because he believed everyone in a free society has to have representation, has to have a lawyer, has to be defended in trial. And then the argument he uses is from a Cicero speech called Pro Malone. So he always uses arguments. It's always any part of life he's looking at him. He's like, But this is the thing. It's not just the Americans who liked him. It was constant. Everyone had something to say about Cicero. John Locke's Second Treatise on Government, which is considered by many to be one of like the founding texts of modern liberalism. The frontispiece, which is like, or epigraph, which is like a little quote before the book starts, is Salus Populi Suprema Lex Esto, which is also my name on Discord. But it means let the welfare of the people be the ultimate law. And so that was a Cicero quote as well. There's always constantly talking about him.
Wow.
And so he's a very underrated figure. People always talk about Plato and Aristotle, but they rarely talk about good old Chickpea. Cicero was a nickname that means chickpea.
Really?
Yeah, it's because he wasn't from Rome. He was from a place called Arpinum, so he was kind of considered a hick.
Wow.
Yeah. He was actually another thing that was impressive about him. I'll do two more things impressive about him because I can only do so many. I can go on for hours. Two things people loved about him in the Enlightenment were he was called what was called a novus homo. In Rome, you had to have kind of ancestors in politics. Otherwise, it's pretty hard to get elected and pretty hard to get favors off people. Cicero didn't.
Sounds like Ireland.
Yeah, basically. But he broke into the scene and became extremely popular very quickly, and even ended up getting the highest position of the Roman political ladder, consul. For his efforts, he thwarted a conspiracy. His famous speech is called the Calenarian Orations, but he was given the title Father of Our Fathers, Pater Patriae, which is a very cool name. But on top of that as well, he was actually a bit of a religious skeptic, which made him very popular in the Enlightenment, in something called the Tusculan Disputations. So he's constantly used by free thinkers and people against organized religion in the state. So he had a lot of uses. And the reason he probably fell out of favor and fell out of fashion with philosophers or political thinkers is probably because the classical curriculum kind of it became outdated eventually. People weren't going towards it anymore in favor of newer ideas like the pragmatists like John Dewey and whatnot. But lovely guy. I always recommend reading him. I have lots of things about him. I think I've written...
You have written about him. I read an article you wrote for Speak Freely, I think, back in the day when you were editor there. And you just opened my eyes. It was like amazing. This guy, obviously... Because I am dumb when it comes to history. I really am. I was the same as you. I really didn't like school. And I gave up studying history after third year. So it's just
there's a great quote by the man himself. He who doesn't understand history is forever a child. Well, that's a bit mean, though. I think that's a little too far, but...
I would agree with parts of that. You know, because it does... If you don't learn from the what's gone before, it's kind of... You remain in a kind of childlike state. I have subsequently learned a little bit about history, so... I'm I'm not so much of a dummy, but like you, some of the gems that you pull out when we're in the conversation, really interesting. The origins of feminism. You pull some historical
Oh,
thing from China, like way back.
oh yeah.
Where
One of the first people to argue that women should be educated is I'm going to mispronounce her name, Ban Zhao, like first century BC China. She's one of the first people I've seen, at least, to argue women should be educated similarly enough to men, which is very rare at the time in ancient China. So give her some credit.
yeah, and you mentioned like other ways where we can learn from history, replace the bad ideas with some of these good ideas that are actually not good ideas. They're actually ideas that people had before, but just bring
Mm.
them back. What else have you come across that we might find interesting?
So I'll talk about the show I host, Portraits of
Yeah.
Liberty. So Portraits of Liberty was the reason I thought of it was there's so many history podcasts these days, and they're great. Nothing against them or anything. But I'm very sick of studying the great men of history. They're not great men. Normally, they're mass murderers or megalomaniacs. They're
Mm,
awful. So I wanted to talk about something a bit more humane. People who pushed forward good ideas that were against the grain of their time, that were radical at the time, and then maybe a lot of these people I talk about had pretty hard lives because of what they said. So it's good to vindicate them after the fact. And so that's the whole point of the show, is to talk about people in history who pushed for a freer world. They're not all libertarians. A lot of them are going to be people from the ancient world or the medieval world, or like they're going to have bad opinions. They're going to have bad ideas on certain things. But the idea is that they pushed for a somewhat freer world and didn't
mm,
get the credit they deserve in history. Because I remember in school, uh, I liked history in school, but it was still you're still kind of learning about all the big men and the big battles, and
yeah.
that's just a bit much. But the reason why I got to this was because I just when you look in the past, there's some bizarre ideas. For example, a classic is Robert Filmer. Robert Filmer is the person that inspired Right Against. Robert Filmer talked about how all authority comes from God. God gave all authority. God gave the world to Adam and Eve, like that Adam. Since Adam owns the world, he can just subdivide it between his sons. The people who are the genealogical offspring of Adam, they own the world, and there's no legitimate reason to resist political authority unless it like is apparent, unless it's the king is saying something about divine law or saying don't be a Christian. But as long as he's not doing that, the only thing you should do as a subject or a citizen is just to shut up and listen. That's it. And I had no idea how anyone thought this was ever a good idea, but some people thought it was brilliant. And people really believed in monarchy. There was a big thing about monarchy was that they were kind of like almost divine. Certain English
Mm,
and French kings, they would touch people and apparently heal them on the spot. When um, Charles II was eventually executed, or was it first Charles II? 16, yeah, 1640 execution, 1649 execution. When the King of England was executed in 1649, his head was cut off. People dipped napkins in the blood because they thought it would be like the blood of Christ, it'd be like a relic. So it's bizarre. People had bizarre opinions, and I wanted to talk about how they got better opinions. And so, and I also wanted to talk about things outside of the Western world. I
yeah.
myself, I suffered from this. I thought West is best because Western philosophy is dominant. It must be the best philosophical tradition ever.
Mm.
No, there's other traditions out there. There's other great ideas, other great thinkers. You just don't. The thing is, you just don't pay attention to them, or just don't look for them.
Well, are they promoted in like curricula in the
No,
Western world? Yeah, that's probably the.
there was a great article that said we should call philosophy departments what they are, Western philosophy departments, because
Mm,
they're not the whole story.
mm,
Don't call it you're not doing every bit of philosophy. You're doing like a very particular bit. You're doing like the European world.
mm.
So that was my objection.
So what do you think that we miss by the focus on history only being focused on the Western world?
Um, I don't think you have to. So there's so much out there. I remember a constant problem I had was whenever I told people I liked history, they were like, "Do you know about this event?" I'm like, "No, because I don't know everything in human experience. I can't list everything there
Did
is."
you not read every single book in Trinity College, like the whole
I was
library?
actually, I'm also very bad at dates. I have to write down dates. I'm not very good at memorizing them. But no, I think that intellectual history is something that a lot of people could get behind, the development of different ideas and tracking how things came to be today.
Mm,
I think that's a much more fruitful avenue of study for the layman. All history is great to study, and there's If you like something, go study it. But for a layperson, I think intellectual history is something we can all kind of get something from,
Mm.
because it makes us examine you look back in the past and you're like, how did they not see the glaring flaws in their argument? But you have to think, well, maybe I'm the same. And so by doing this, you kind of put a mirror to yourself and your own biases and your own ideas you never even thought that you had, but you do implicitly hold.
Yeah. And the podcasts that you have recorded, they all aim in and around 20 to 30 minutes, and they've got some nice
About
music.
20 minutes, yeah, nice
Yeah, about
relaxed
20 minutes. Nice and
dulcet
relaxing,
tones.
but really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think yesterday, the one that I was reading, you threw a few laughs in, and I was like,
Oh,
"That's hilarious."
I've gotten to the. At first, I was much more wooden, but there's been times where I've laughed at my own jokes, and
Yeah, that's brilliant, though.
they're not edited out, sadly.
It's
No,
brilliant. I love that.
um, but no. So the first few episodes, I'll just list some of the people I talk about. Christine de Pizan, who is a medieval feminist.
Mm,
Yes, a medieval feminist, at a time when women were completely shat upon from a great height. Another one is about Cato's letters, the namesake of the Cato Institute. These two English thinkers, radical Englishmen, were very libertarian. And one of them even went to Trinity College, John Trenchard. So that's nice.
you.
And then my other one is a man I will cry about for years upon years, Francois Poulain de la Barre.
Yeah.
I can get into why I'm so angry at the world for not loving Francois de
Go
la
on,
Barre.
tell us. I listened to that one. That was actually very good. Tell us the story.
The story starts off with a French psychologist going into the National Library at Paris, and he finds Francois Poulain de la Barre's work, and he picks up the book, and the pages are uncut, meaning no one had ever actually read the
Never
book,
read.
which is
Unbelievable.
so. Anyway, this man, absolute genius. He was born into a pretty wealthy family. This is in the 17th century, but he was born in 1647, and then eventually he goes into college. He goes into school. Doesn't particularly like the curriculum. What's called the scholastic curriculum. A lot of it's based around learning off parts of Aristotle, church fathers, ancient authors. A huge part of it is based around quoting uh, authoritative authors to build your argument. It's not using just your own reason alone. It's like using the precedent as well. And so Poulain wasn't really mad into this and wasn't particularly into education. But then one day, a friend of his convinces him to go to a conference on Descartes, Rene Descartes, the famous philosopher.
Mm,
I'm not going to go into everything that Descartes said because that's too much. But a big part of Descartes' philosophy is just to clear your mind of all preconceptions. It's to really peel back to just your mind, nothing else. Don't all these other things, all these authoritative authors, that means nothing. Just think about the facts itself, trying to get to a rationalist reason on its own. Some people have a big opposition to that, but it was absolutely genius. He was like, oh my God, my eyes have been opened. He said that in the 6 months he started reading people like Descartes, he'd learned more than the years of education he had been through. So he decided that he'd write his own text. So the big problem of the world was prejudice, in his opinion. So prejudice is the enemy of truth in his eyes. It's like, it's things that we don't think about. We accept,
mm.
but we don't really think them through. We just go, oh yeah, cool. He calls it, the greatest enemy of truth. And he decides, okay, well, prejudice is bad and stops us from progressing as human beings. So the thing to do is, if I destroy the biggest prejudice in the world, all the rest will just follow suit, right? It won't be too difficult. So he thinks the biggest prejudice in the world is people's opinion of women. Hard to stress how negatively most people in human history have thought of women. There was a guy around the same time called Alexis Trousset. I can't pronounce his name. I'm so sorry to France. But he wrote A to Z on all the reasons he hates women. That's not a joke. And he has a very vitriolic opening where he calls them all sorts of names, the corrupter of men, this, that, and the other. Terrible. But
Was he an
this,
incel?
yeah. Well, there are people in history who you could maybe consider incels because they were celibate people who had to write about why. A lot of monks, they decided since they're celibate, they have to talk about how much they hate women, how much they're terrible, and it's
Mm.
really better to be celibate. And all this sex stuff is a bit.
Yeah.
There was a guy called Matthias, and he talked about how you should, if you're going to have any women at all in your life, you have to treat them like straw and have a harem. That's the only acceptable way to be around them. Basically,
Dear.
they weren't thought of as intellectual beings whatsoever. They had no abilities. They were just kind of procreation and beauty, and even then, they moaned too much. And Boulain was like, "This is ridiculous." He came to the conclusion that the mind honestly has no sex. Reason is reason. That's that. And he starts going in this anthropological idea of how the subjection of women came around. So he goes back to like the Stone Ages. Men are stronger than women and have to procreate, so they can't go out hunting. And this started excluding their activities, and just because of a division of labor due to their bodies. But then, as civilization grew with agriculture, literacy, philosophy, all these different fields that start to build up, women were still excluded based on this old hunter-gatherer distinction.
Mm.
So it was just chance. Chance, violence, and custom is what he says caused the subjection of women. And now we've all just told ourselves this is the way things have to be. And so a big part of Poulen's writings, it's not about political principles always. A lot of it's about your own imagination. He says, like, just because we think something is well established, that's the way it has to be. And he's like, no, you have to imagine the world the way it could be. And the way, if we just got rid of all these different ideas we have, or all these innate ideas, if we went back, we peeled back all of our preconceptions of the world and started anew, just thought about how things should be, realize that the world would be a lot different place. And he starts to get more radical with this. It's not just women he talks about. He talks about, why is it that there's all these noble Frenchmen who sit around all day and do nothing with their lives, but then there's all these peasants who actually contribute to the wealth of the world?
Wow.
Why is that the case? And he's like, well, maybe peasants could be doctors, lawyers, philosophers, if only they were just given the chance. And so it's not, in the 17th century France, Francois Poulain de la Barre was possibly the most radical egalitarian who was on the planet. That's not that ridiculous to say, because in his writings, a lot of people might find him boring because they look at his writings and say, yeah, we all know women are equal. It's like, well, people didn't.
Yeah.
People definitely didn't. And so I think he's one of the most underrated. Maybe he's not a libertarian, he didn't talk about limited government or anything, but he argued for the freedom of half the planet.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty good track record. I'll take that.
Yeah.
And so he's a genius. And I think that a lot more people need to read Paul Francois. He wrote 3 main books. He wrote, I need to get the names of them properly because I always get the names a little wrong. First one was on the equality of the sexes. Then it was which is just a straight up treatise where he's talking about how men and women are equal intellectually. And that's that. The second one is on the education of ladies, where it's kind of like a dialogue of different characters. And no one was responding to his arguments, so he made someone to respond to his arguments himself. He wrote a book called On the Excellence of Men, which is someone arguing for the opposite position, and then he refutes that position as well.
Wow.
But a big problem, I forget the exact president, but he talks about possibly the reason why Poulain was so ignored is because people thought he was joking.
Right.
Because it was just such a out there idea at the time. They're like, oh, that's funny. That was it.
That's incredible. Who else do you like from history?
Mm-hmm.
What other faves have you got?
I like so many people. Well, people I've covered, I guess, it's important people to talk about, right?
Of course.
Yeah, that'd be... Well, Christine de Pizan. Oh, well, that's another feminist. We've already done one feminist. We'll do someone else. A person who's coming out new. There's a new episode of the podcast coming out. I think it's either this week or next week. Don't quote me on that. John Cook. John Cook is the first person to prosecute a head of state. That's pretty cool.
Wow.
So
where was that?
This is in England.
England?
Yeah. So there's always been these ideas of when it's okay to resist a tyrant. There's the idea of tyrannicide, when it's morally acceptable to kill a tyrant. And people were always talking about that since the ancient times. But very few people talked about kind of like an institutionalized version of this, like an actual court, a trial. So anyway, let's talk a little about Cook. Cook was born in 1608 into a really small, poor farming family. He would have been a farmer like his dad and his granddad, but thankfully there was a man called Nicholas Wadham who had this scholarship for college, so he got to go to school, get educated, and then he went on to become a lawyer. And it's important to talk about how law was perceived at the time. This is the 17th century was the rise of absolutism all over the world. Remember that guy Robert Filmer I talked about? Kings really did believe they were divine. It wasn't a joke. They really thought their power was given to them by God and that people couldn't resist them justifiably. That's just the way they sound like cartoon villains, but that's the way they thought of the world, and they thought no one was able to legitimately resist them. But anyway, England was a little special because there was Magna Carta, which was a rebellion of barons against the king in the 1200s. And they established some sort of rudimentary rights like habeas corpus and having a parliament and no taxation without consent and whatnot.
Mm.
Now, consent of a very small group of people, but
Yeah.
nonetheless push towards something better. So, um, what happened was Charles became king while Cook was growing up, and he basically said, "I don't really like this parliament thing. I don't like sharing power. It's just such a pain. I don't want to do it." And so he had his own personal rule for 11 years. Eventually, Parliament comes to him with something called the Grand Remonstrance, which is this big list of grievances and possible reforms. He doesn't like that whatsoever. A civil war erupts. The Civil War is terrible, awful. Uh, a large proportion of English people died in it. Uh, Something like 1 in 10 Englishmen died, which makes it very similar to World War One's casualty rate. So it was really devastating. So eventually, the parliamentarians, or the Roundheads, win, and they what's the word? They arrest Charles. But there was always this paradox on the parliamentarian side. They were trying to beat the king to reinstate him as the head of state. They didn't imagine a world without a king. They thought, well, we'll beat him, we'll put him back in power with limited powers, and it'll all be good. A bizarre idea for us, I know. You think, why would you ever do this? But anyway, they have him arrested, they're talking to him, they're negotiating. The man, mad bastard Charles, schemes another plan, pays the Scottish to invade England, and gets all these royalists to ride all over the place. The Parliament has to put down another little mini civil war, and they're just exasperated. They don't know what they're doing. So they decide this was about Magna Carta. It was about the rule of law and the supremacy of law over divine right.
Mm.
And so they decide, we're going to put the king on trial for what he did, which is they could have just killed him. Honestly, they could have done that. There was a logic at the time that while you're at war with someone, it's perfectly justifiable to kill them, even if they are king. But they said no. We're gonna go do this properly. Now John Cook was a very respected lawyer, but he was not the safest pair of hands for this case because he was a very radical person. He had argued for. He actually wrote his own little hit piece called "Vindications of Lawyers" or "Vindication of Profession of Lawyers," where he talked about how lawyers, they need to stop scrounging people. They need to make the law simpler to understand. They need to have mercy for people who are poor. They can't just you'd be hung for stealing a shilling. They need to get rid of all these unequal laws. For example, the benefit of the
Yeah,
clergy.
I like that.
The idea that you get it. The benefit of the clergy was if you're educated, your first crime doesn't count. It's a get out of jail free card because you're educated. But he said no. People who are educated have no reason to break the
Yeah.
law. That's even worse. So he was a very radical for the time, and he even argued for things such as loosening the licenses for doctors because there wasn't enough at the time in London. He even defended a doctor who had practiced without a license. Heinous, I know. Heinous. Terrible. Saving people's lives without the proper
How
paperwork.
dare he?
So it wasn't like he was,
Papers.
yeah. Yeah, that was, so he was a very progressive person, but wasn't the same fans. They didn't know what he would do. He supported the Civil War, but again, he was kind of this pretty radical guy. He was too principled for them. They wanted someone in safer hands. They found someone called Matthew Steele. But you have to think about it. Most people in England did still believe in monarchy. They still believed the king was semi-divine, if not really divine. People had a lot of respect for monarchy. So there was a lot of people out there who were ready to kill anyone who tried to do anything to the king. So this was a dangerous court case. The president of the court, John Bradshaw, in his fur, it was his fur cap. He put a big thing of lead to stop a bullet from going through, and wore armor under his robes. John Cook didn't do this, but yes. But John Cook was going to gather legal arguments and evidence and whatnot. But Matthew Steele, the guy who's going to be the head prosecutor, he feigns sickness. He's too scared. He doesn't know what's going to happen. So John Cook is put in 2 weeks before from the head prosecutor and writes this amazing case. So what happens is Charles is dragged into court in Westminster, the biggest hall in England at the time. Acoustics are terrible, so they have these. They have a little press gallery for all these newspaper guys, and Charles walks out, very lavishly dressed, with a little pin of St. George and whatnot. And he sits down. He's still a king, and people still think quite seriously about kings these days. And so John Bradshaw, the president of the court, he talks about why they're here. Eventually, he asks John Cook to read the charge, and this is the best moment of Cook's life in my eyes. He starts reading the charge, and the king has a cane with a silver tip, and he just taps him, and he says, "Hold." Now, I don't know why he asked him to hold. I don't know what he was waiting for. But John Cook's like, okay. He starts reading again, and he goes, "Hold," and you're kind of like, "What? What are you at?" So Cook one more time decides to read, and it sounds like he smacked him hard enough with the cane. He smacked him, and the silver tip of the cane falls off and rolls onto the floor. And Charles, being king, he's 5'4", just a little squat man on the chair. He says, he kind of gestures to Cook, "Pick it up. Go on, pick it up." And Cook looks him dead in the eye as he asks him to pick it up and reads out the charge, which would have read something like this. Well, actually, it did read something like this. It's not would have read, it is. And the said John Cook, on behalf of the people of England, does for the said treasons and crimes impeach the said Charles Stuart as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and a public and implacable enemy to the Commonwealth of England. Said that dead to his face. And Charles kind of slinks into his chair and he goes down and he picks up the silver tip.
Wow.
And everyone sees it. It's this massive moment of the king, divine law bowing to man-made law. It's the
Oh yeah.
triumph of the
Symbolic.
rule of law, the rule of kings, and everyone's like, "Oh my god!" And apparently, the king was even pretty shook by this, and he was like, "Someone must have messed with the tip of my cane. It must have been this radical preacher who did it." But eventually, so the king, what happens is the trial begins in earnest, and the king doesn't plead. He just says, "I don't. The legitimacy of this court, doesn't make any sense. You're just a ragtag group of people. You've no right. I'm the king. I can't be judged by anyone. There's no peers to me. A jury is the peers of a person.
Yeah.
You can't judge me. Sorry about you." Denies the legitimacy, does this for a few days. And John Cook says, "Well, look, this is going to be taken as what's called a pro confessio. If you don't plead, it's an implicit confession of guilt because you're not even bothering to defend yourself." This kind of transpires. They really didn't want to kill the king, but eventually they say, this has to be the way. But what happened was, on the second day of the court, Charles is walking out with his guards, and this is the thing you should never do. Apparently, you should never talk to your prison guards. Who's walking, and he said, "All those people who died in the Civil War, I over it. I only lose sleep over like one person who was a good friend. Everyone else." And the guards immediately report this, and John Cook is like perturbed. Think about all the death and destruction this guy caused, and he says, "I don't really care that much. I'm the king. I can do whatever I want." So eventually, they say, "Look, you're not going to plead. That's it." And so, to satiate other judges' consciences, Cook lays out in private the evidence for his war crimes. It's actually, he doesn't get to ever do his amazing prosecution, which is so sad, but he lays out all these kind of legal and moral arguments. So the first one is like the legal argument. The legal argument is, look, we all saw you at these battles. You had what's called command responsibility. You were the one who ordered a lot of these things. You could have not done these things. You tortured innocent citizens. You killed people who were already prisoners. You did all this. That's on you. No one told you to do that. You commanded it. Therefore, you've got command responsibility. That's a war crime. Crime against humanity is what it was called. That's the first step. The second step is kind of a political argument. And a political argument is that the king isn't a person. The king is an office. It's a trust.
Yeah.
You're given this power with the trust that you'll use it well. And once you break that trust, there's nothing wrong with deposing you whatsoever. And he says, all power comes from the consent of the people. And so a lot of people said this at the time. They said, all the power comes from the consent of the people. And if the king breaks his obligations to them, they're perfectly just existing. But Cook goes a step further and says, well, since all power is invested in the people, they can change their mind for any reason. They can say, I don't want a king anymore, let's do something else. And so this is much more radical than people are used to. They're like, oh, so we can just get rid of the king just because we don't like him? He's like, yeah, because he's not special. And so the last part is the moral argument where he says, there's a natural law. It says something along the lines of, written in every man's heart with a pen of diamond, which is a very cool phrase, is the idea that if a king becomes a tyrant, he shall die for it. And so John Cook makes his great case. But eventually, so England was declared a republic for the first time. It didn't go great. It didn't go particularly amazing. Oliver Cromwell at the head of the state was basically like his own mini monarch. It wasn't.
Oh, he wasn't
the
great.
Best. Not for Irish people, no. A lot of people died. So
yeah,
Cromwell can sometimes be thought of as a hero for some, but for Irish people, no. But besides that, the republic eventually falls, and a new king comes back. Charles is executed, but his son comes along, and he lays out a general amnesty for everyone who was in the Civil War, except for people who are on the prosecution team. And so John Cook is arrested for his crime of being the prosecutor against the king. And
Wow.
it's well, so John Cook was a commoner, not a rich man. Um, and what's the word? The punishment for commoners for treason was hanging, drawing, and quartering,
Oh God.
which is the most miserable way to die. You know, feel free to mute at this point if you don't like things that are gruesome. You're hung till you're choking. Then your stomach is cut open, and your entrails are pulled out and lit in fire in front of you. And eventually, sometimes they would cut off your penis and wave it in front of your face as well. And then they would cut up your body into little pieces, try and preserve them, and put them all over the country on spikes. An absolutely heinous
Charming.
thing to do. Yeah, barbaric, truly. I don't know how anyone thought this was a good thing to do.
God.
John Cook defends himself against a packed jury in an ever-changing law. They just change the laws to suit themselves. But he actually gives a really good principle that he puts forward. It's called what's called the taxi cab rank rule today, is that lawyers don't choose their cases. When the case is put to them, that's their case. It's just their obligation to take it.
Mm.
Because like whether it suits me or not, that's what I had to do. That's the way it works. That's how lawyers have to be. I have no responsibility for this. It's just like today, if a lawyer had to defend a pedophile or a rapist in court, someone has to defend him. He has to have legal representation. That's the way it is. And so it makes this amazingly modern sounding argument in front of the court. And some people are almost convinced by him, but they say, no, we don't want this guy whatsoever. And so eventually John Cook is hung, drawn, and quartered. But while in prison, was a great way. I think the best way to sum up the kind of man Cook was, he was a man about fairness and equality for all people. Not equality in like, we should all have the same things, but he was an idea of whether you're poor or rich, the law is the same. There's no two ways about it. And he had this letter he wrote to someone in prison, and I think he has a great little quote in it where he says he dedicated his life to that noble principle of preferring universality before particularity, which I think is just brilliant.
Yeah.
But John Cook is a very, very obscure figure. And the only reason I know about it is because a man called Geoffrey Robertson wrote an amazing book on him called The Tyrannicide Brief that I'd recommend people read. That's how I know everything about it. But it was the first time a head of state been prosecuted. Normally, head of states are supposed to be immune from this kind of thing.
Mm.
And the precedent of Cook kind of inadvertently leads to the trials of people like Slobodan Milosevic and Pinochet eventually. And people like Milosevic did the same thing that King Charles would do. They deny the legitimacy of the courts. Nothing changes. They always have the same strategy. And also, he might have pulled another play from his book. The king sat alone. He had all these people who were offering to be his lawyer, but he's like, no, I'll sit alone because it'll make me look like a martyr. And he did play the part of the martyr quite well. Till the end of even before he's about to be executed, he kept saying that he was an innocent man. So.
Yeah, very interesting. That's a fascinating story. Thanks for sharing that. And when is that podcast out? This week?
I think it's this week or next week. It'll be soon.
Amazing.
But yes, this is the point of Portraits of Liberty is that, learning about people like Napoleon and Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, yeah, it's interesting. They're great generals, but they're terrible people. They're megalomaniacs. They're mass murderers. They're really, if we met them today, they're basically the bottom rung of good people.
That's fascinating. Because it sounds like you're trying to do is you're trying to put the morality back into history, which is sucked out of most history. Like when you learn about history, it's like these figures are written about with all of these heinous crimes, sort of blended in almost with this language, which is shady and it's not nice.
Yeah. Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars is him basically admitting to war crimes. It's him saying he did all these terrible things and boasting about how many Gauls he killed. He's a terrible person. So I think we have to worship the right people in history, or we're not going to worship someone because worship is a bad word to use. But if we're going to appreciate anyone in history, we should appreciate those who pushed a more humane vision of the world. People like John Cook, people like Christina Pizan, people like Cato, like the authors of Cato's letters and whatnot. These kind of people who pushed for a much freer, nicer, not so barbaric and brutal world.
Exactly.
And the thing I learned about a lot of them is that they always didn't like their education a lot of the time. They always were very unhappy with how they were supposed to be taught. They always wanted, a lot of them they taught themselves a lot of the time. So very interesting to see what these kind of people who went against the grain, they tended not to like the society they had to be born into and not the things they had to learn and the values they had to absorb.
That's fascinating. That is fascinating. What do you think the point is of history?
The point? Oh God, that's a great question. Some people ask. Nowadays, I wonder because is there the world's become so unprecedented, right? In the last 100 years, it's just there's things we never would have dreamed of seeing: hyperabundance and new kinds of problems, and either global pandemics or climate change. You don't know how the hell could a Roman in the first century BC tell you anything useful today? And I think a lot of history is about appreciating the very fragile state of the world. Things can always change, and they can always change for the worse. We've seen it in
Mhm.
history that there's terrible regimes that just rush into power, and all of a sudden, everyone's world is turned upside down. Um, I said the exact same thing in another podcast very recently, but I like it. I forget who said the quote. Freedom's a bit like air. You don't realize it's gone. You don't realize it's there until it's gone.
Yeah.
You don't really appreciate it very much. I think a lot of history should be about learning about how the world became freer, and not just learning about all these big battles and political movements. It should be about learning something a bit more how we came to be who we are today.
Yeah.
Whether that's in your own particular country or your own religion or your own culture, there's always a way to find more about it. I remember I was blown away that there were so many different feminist authors around the world. I'm reading about like a Japanese feminist in the late
Mm.
1800s, who was writing about the three boxes you put women into. I was like, this just isn't talked about. We just don't appreciate these people. We don't have our knowledge of history is very limited in some ways. And of course, it's hard to tell people that they should go read these highly obscure, often difficult to read texts. It's not like reading John Cook's prosecution that he published. It's not easy. It's written in Old English. You have to have a lot of historical context. And so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make it easier for people. I have time to do this. It's my job. So I'll do it for you. I will make it as easy as possible for you to enjoy this, because I understand that you have a life to live. You have a job. And it's very annoying when people tell you you need to know this part of history. Well, I have a life. I have a family. I have hobbies. I can't just sit down and read Immanuel Kant's Critique of
Yeah.
Pure Reason and get into it. So the best way to do it is to get someone to help you along. And I humbly hope that I can help people along learning a little bit more about the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way you are speaking on your podcast is really accessible, and
Mm.
it's fantastic. You've got a nice Irish accent, unlike mine.
I've been told I sound American. So when I was living in Ireland so long ago, um, when I was living in Ireland, everyone said I sounded American, and they always asked if I watched too much TV as a kid. I didn't. And then when I moved to America, hoity-toity Irish. So my identity is lost. I don't know who I am anymore.
Yeah, so you've moved to DC. You moved earlier in the year. Tell us a little bit about what it's like to work in the Cato Institute.
Yeah, I got a H-1B visa and came over. The visa takes so long. I don't know why it took so long, but it took not okay. Now, so long in my terms. Some people wait years for visas. I waited a few months, and I was like, crying into my soup. Um, but I moved over. I started in September, and it's great working at the Cato Institute. Absolutely brilliant. It's a rare place where you can really work on your passion. You can do something you truly love, and not everyone gets the chance to do that always.
Mm.
A lot of people have to work just to work, and it's really a privilege to work that you're genuinely passionate and interested in, and every day you get to do something that you really really want to do. And like, I get to read books for a living, which is that's just, I don't know how I got that. I don't know how I got so lucky. There must be something helping me out, but yeah.
The Cato Institute, for anyone who is, not a libertarian or interested, what do the Cato Institute do?
Cato Institute is a libertarian think tank that argues for, as I've said, a freer world, a limited government, peace, international cooperation, free trade, rights for everyone, not just for some people. Brilliant organization. Everyone should check out their work. A lot of the stuff is just, it's very commonsensical. I don't think it's particularly, people act as if it's radical. It's not really. But yeah, wonderful place to work, and it's got a good legacy.
What's the legacy? Tell us more.
Good. No, just being on a lot of the right side of the issues and not being too fervent for war and whatnot, and like arguing for things like gay marriage and legalizing of drugs before it became popular. Trend setting a lot of the times.
So on the
So
right
I
side of history.
never use the right side of history phrase. You never know. 1,000 years from now, we could all be vegetarians and we could all be viewed as the ultimate savages. So no one's on the right side of history. But the Cato Institute does a lot of great work.
Ooh, that's an interesting take. Do you think that that's going to happen? Do you
Oh,
foresee?
I have no idea, but think about it this way. Most people didn't really think about the fact that they had slaves.
Yeah.
So it's not like a lot of people thought it very weirdly. The founding fathers wrote all men are created equal, and still most of them had slaves.
Yeah.
Not John Adams though, my favorite. So go him.
Wow, interesting.
But no, there's always hmm. No. I just I always tell people that because you have to think about how you'll be viewed in history,
Mm.
and reading history makes you really think about your own implicit biases, things that you don't really examine. Like people in the medieval ages, they really just thought monarchy was the way to be. They're kind of like, what other way is there to do
Yeah.
things? I don't know. And so you don't want to fall into that trap yourself. So you look at other times and you look at how dumb they look and wonder, what could I look dumb over? I just think vegetarianism is a good example sometimes. Not that I'm a vegetarian. I'm terrible. I'm carnivore in all ways. But it's just good to make people examine that maybe the behaviors they're doing on a regular basis might not be moral, and you should think about it a little more.
Well, just to add to that, I hope that in a couple of centuries' time that people view statism as
Mm-hmm.
one of those things, because
Mm-hmm.
some of the things that we allow states get away with, I know they'll look back in the future and go, "What were those lunatics thinking about?"
There's a lot of that. There's an ancient Chinese philosopher called Mencius, and now I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the quote all in my head on time. But he basically asks, "Is it wrong to kill a man with a blade?" Yep. Sorry, Mencius was a traveling philosopher, like his teacher Confucius, or like not teacher, the person who inspired him, Confucius.
Hmm.
And he traveled around China, and he went in like the 5th century BC. And he traveled around talking to all these different people, and his idea was to have a more humane government, rule by virtuous leaders, rule with like not all this coercive force, lead people to the right path, don't force them down it. Brilliant
Beautiful.
philosopher. Might have got the centuries wrong there, but that's just because I have a bad memory.
We'll let you
But
out of
there's a great dialogue he has. They're all dialogues. One of them is great where he asks a local lord. He says, "Is it wrong to kill a man with a blade?" And he goes, "Yes." "Okay. Is it wrong to kill a guy with a club?" "Yes." "Is it wrong to kill a guy with the government?" He's like, "I will change the topic now." This is a lot of his dialogues end with different lords saying, I will now change the topic." He has another one where he again, I'm paraphrasing, wasn't it perfectly. He basically asks a guy, he said, if you had a guy in your royal, he's talking to another lord, always a lord. He says, if you had a guy in your court and you asked him to bring your wife and kids to another province, and he didn't give them food, didn't give them clothes, they had to walk on the ground the entire time, what would you do? He's like, well, I'd fire him. Mm-hmm. So what if you had like a sergeant in your army and he never really trained the troops and didn't really have much leadership? And you're like, well, I'd fire him. He's like, so what if there was like a king who wasn't doing any of his duties and ruining the world? Yeah, it's the guy's like, I'd like to change the topic now. It's always I'd like to change the topic.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not really in the mood.
That's
And
uncomfortable.
yeah. So he's a great guy. So that's just another example of a great philosopher that you might not have heard of because Chinese philosophy isn't that often touched upon.
Yeah, amazing. Are you gonna? He sounds like a character. Are you gonna make a podcast about him? Because
I have an essay about him. I have an
okay,
essay out there.
I'd love to read that. I'd love to
do a
read that.
podcast eventually.
Yeah.
Don't you worry. But I've got my quote here for him. So he's talking to one guy, and he's talking about whether it's okay to kill a king. This is the same thing about the firing. The king asks him, like, is it true that these guys killed the king in the past? And he's like, no. He says, one who mutilates righteousness should be called a crippler. A crippler and a mutilator are called a mere fellow. He says, I've heard of that guy being killed, but I have not heard the assassination of a king. And his basic argument is, once you stop acting like a leader, once you go beyond your legitimate means of power, you're not a king anymore. There's nothing special about you. You're like anyone else.
Mm.
And your crimes are crimes. A crime is a crime no matter what. So
Yeah.
people like there's a lot of parallels between people like John
Yeah.
Cook and Mencius, and even actually John Locke has a very similar argument. Second Treason of Government about when it's okay to depose the tyrant. He's like, well, once they break their trust, they're just a private person like anyone else. Very
Mhm.
similar to Mencius. So you can see all these different cultures and parallels constantly
Yeah.
coming together, and it's never this idea that West is best in philosophy. It's not the way it has to be.
Yeah.
There's so much more out there.
Yeah, it's fantastic because I love the way you're drawing all of these things together and making the case. This is really vital. Narrative is very important as well, and like I know talking to you over the years that you always make a really interesting narrative out of these stories, and that's important as well because you have to.
Mhm.
I suppose we have to sell these ideas, and if they're yawn, boring books that are never read, um, you have to bring them to life, and you
Mm.
definitely have a really good way of doing that. Leave us with some interesting final words. What would you say about what should people think about history? What is your message for people? Why
Oh,
why listen to Paul Meany's podcast, Portraits on Liberty? Portraits
of
of
Liberty.
of
You'll never get it right, will
Portrait.
you? No, why should you listen to it? Well, because it's me, it's mine. Of course, I'm going to argue you should listen to me, but um, it's hard to read about these people. It's hard to read about good people in history because they tend to be so obscured. They're not the great ones. And so this is just an easy way, 15, 20 minutes to learn about someone you would have never learned about before otherwise, and just something to think about. And it's not a big time commitment. It's nice, easy, and
Yeah,
accessible. And above all, it's just adding more and more to the libertarian canon. Now, not all these people are libertarians, but I think anyone who argues for a freer world should be on our side in
big time.
history. That's always the way it should be. We should always vindicate those who did good things. We
Hmm.
should talk about how great they are. Not all of them are great. A lot of them have problems in their lives. A lot of them did bad things. But there's so many philosophers in history who get so much credit for having terrible ideas that shouldn't really be around, and so many who wrote brilliant ideas that are completely forgotten. And so we should all celebrate that. Celebrate the great moderate libertarians of throughout history who've tried for a freer world. Yeah.
Absolutely, and we should celebrate you, Paul. You're an absolute wonder.
Oh, you're a gem.
Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been amazing.
Thank you so much.
And we will see you all soon, folks. Thank you for joining me. All the best.